The night the field hospital almost fell, everyone was already convinced Lena Sayegh was just a pair of steady hands and a soft voice. They'd been calling her night nurse, the way people do when they don't bother learning anything else about you. Not cruelly, not always. Sometimes it was even affectionate. But underneath it sat a clean, dismissive certainty. Lena belonged in the shadows of the ward, changing dressings, charting vitals, taking orders from people who spoke louder and wore their authority like armor. And right now, in the thin, fluorescent light that made every face look tired and every stain on the floor look permanent, Lena stood with a blood pressure cuff in one hand and a pen in the other, while a man twice her size shouted over her shoulder. "Move," snapped Dr. Marko Vukovic, the visiting trauma lead. "I need room, I need silence." Silence was a luxury the field hospital had never owned. The canvas walls trembled with distant concussions. The generator coughed like an old smoker. Somewhere outside, engines whined and then cut off, too abruptly to be friendly. Lena didn't flinch. She didn't even look up at Marko. She finished writing the number, capped the pen, and clipped the chart back to the bed. The patient was conscious, pale, trying to be brave for the people watching. "Your pressure's holding," Lena said, her voice low and even. "Stay with me, slow breaths in through the nose." The patient obeyed her, not Marko. Because when you're scared, you listen to the person who sounds like they've already seen the worst and didn't break. Marko noticed, of course. His jaw tightened like he'd bitten into something hard. "Did you hear me?" he demanded. Lena finally looked at him, calm eyes, no apology in them. "I heard you. I'm finishing the check." Marko opened his mouth to say something sharp, something that would make the orderlies smirk and the junior medics pretend they hadn't heard. But a new sound swallowed the moment whole. 3 fast cracks, close enough to rattle the surgical trays. Not inside, not yet. Outside the triage tent, voices rose. A runner stumbled in, dirt on his face, headset hanging loose like a torn lifeline. "Breach," he gasped. "North fence armed group." The word armed made the air change. People in hospitals know a certain kind of fear, the kind that comes with blood loss and airway compromise and a monitor's flat tone. But this was different. This was the fear that didn't care if you were saving lives. This was the fear that could walk into your bright, fragile little island of order and turn it into noise. Marko's face drained. He looked toward the entrance flap like he expected it to fly open any second. Lena didn't. She turned her head slightly, listening, not to the yelling but to the spacing between sounds, to the rhythm of boots, to the way the distant shouting rose and then abruptly dipped, like someone had shoved a muzzle into the mouth of the crowd. And she said, almost too quietly to be heard, "Lock down the narc cabinet." Marko stared at her. "What?" "Now," Lena repeated, and there was something in her tone that didn't ask. "And get everyone away from the windows." An orderly hesitated. Marko looked offended, as if Lena had stepped into a lane she didn't belong in. Then the head nurse, Sana Al-Khatib, snapped into motion. "Do it, move." The tent erupted into coordinated chaos. Tables shoved, curtains pulled, bodies guided to safer angles. Marko leaned closer to Lena, voice harsh. "You don't give orders here." Lena's eyes stayed on the entrance. "Then give better ones." A second later, the flap tore open. 2 men pushed in, not patients, not staff. Their clothes were mismatched, faces wrapped in scarves, rifles held with the casual confidence of people used to being obeyed. Behind them, more shadows crowded at the threshold. The first man's gaze swept the room and landed on the surgical tables, the oxygen cylinders, the pale faces. His rifle rose, not aimed at any one person, but at the idea of resistance. "No phones," he barked in accented Arabic. "No radio, everyone stays." Someone whimpered, someone else whispered a prayer. Marko froze, hands half raised, as if he could explain his way out. Lena did not move. Not because she wasn't afraid. Because she was counting. 2 in the tent, at least 3 more outside from the shape of the shadows. A 4th no, 5th footstep pattern heavier, impatient, leadership. And then behind the insurgents she saw it. A stretcher being pushed fast, guarded like it carried gold. On the stretcher was a man with a face that didn't belong in a tent like this. Clean-shaven, expensive watch still on his wrist, a patch of blood on his suit jacket that looked obscene against the canvas and grit. His eyes were open, glassy, searching. And when he saw Lena, something flickered, recognition or hope or both. The lead insurgent jerked his chin toward the stretcher. "Doctor, treat him now." "What?" Marco swallowed. We need to assess." The rifle lifted an inch higher. "You assess faster." Marco's hands shook as he approached. Lena stepped in beside him, and he shot her a glare that said, "Get back in your place." But the insurgent's attention shifted to Lena anyway. "You," he said, "nurse." Lena met his eyes. "Yes." "You help, you do exactly as told." "I will help the patient," Lena replied carefully. "But you need to move your men back. They're contaminating the sterile area." The insurgent barked a laugh. "Sterile in a war tent." Lena's expression didn't change. "Infection kills quietly. You'll lose him after you win him." The man stared, weighing whether her audacity was worth punishing. Then, surprisingly, he gestured sharply, 2 steps back. His men obeyed. Marco looked at Lena like he'd just watched the ground shift under his feet. And that was the first small fracture in everyone's assumptions, before the night nurse became something else entirely. Pause. If you're already feeling the tension in this tent, and you want to see exactly how Lena gets from being dismissed in a corridor to being the one person armed men can't ignore, take a second right now to subscribe to this channel. Because stories like this don't just turn. They snap, and you won't want to miss where this one goes next. The field hospital sat on the outskirts of Gaziantep, Turkey, close enough to the Syrian border that the wind sometimes carried the dull thud of distant fighting like weather. Officially, it was a humanitarian trauma station run by an international coalition of NGOs with quiet government cooperation. Unofficially, it was a pressure valve, a place where the wounded came fast, where paperwork followed slowly, and where the line between civilian and combatant blurred as soon as blood hit the floor. It was also a place where hierarchy mattered. Not the hierarchy written on the org chart, the one you could feel. Doctors from abroad who arrived with credentials and confidence. Local staff who held the place together with experience and exhaustion. Translators who knew everything and were treated like furniture. Security who were expected to be invisible until they failed. And nurses. Nurses were the backbone, praised in speeches, ignored in decisions. Lena Sayegh had been hired 6 months earlier, recommended by a Lebanese NGO and cleared through a chain of background checks that felt more like suspicion than procedure. She was 32, small enough that some people mistook her for younger, with dark hair always pinned up and eyes that missed very little. She worked nights by choice. On paper, it was because the night shift needed experienced hands. In reality, nights gave her space. Less visiting leadership, less show, more medicine. Sana Al-Khatib, the head nurse, had noticed Lena's habits early. The way she arrived 15 minutes early and walked the perimeter of the ward as if mapping it. The way she checked exit routes and fire extinguishers without being asked. The way she always positioned herself where she could see the doors. Sana had asked once gently, "You were in emergency work before." Lena had smiled, polite but closed. "I've been in places where doors matter." That was all she'd said. Most people didn't push. Dr. Marko Vukovic did. Marko was Serbian, late 30s, brilliant hands, and a personality sharpened by the kind of career that rewards certainty. He'd come in as a rotating trauma lead, 3 months, high pressure, high ego, high expectations. In the first week, he'd made it clear he believed the hospital ran on a simple truth. Doctors commanded, nurses executed. He didn't scream often. He didn't need to. He could cut with tone alone. "Night shift is where ambition goes to sleep," he'd said once at a briefing, glancing at Lena as if she were proof of his point. A few junior doctors laughed, eager to belong. Lena had kept her eyes on the chart. The micro-humiliations stacked like thin sheets of plastic, each one light, but together suffocating. Marco called her nurse, even though he knew her name. He corrected her in front of interns even when she was right. He dismissed her suggestions with a hand wave. Once, during a mass casualty intake, Lena had flagged that a patient's breathing sounded wrong, subtle but wrong. Marco had brushed her off. "Anxiety, we see it every day." 10 minutes later, the patient crashed. They saved him, barely. Afterward, Marco had said, "Good catch," like he'd been the one to catch it. Lena had nodded once and gone back to work. But people noticed. Not the praise Marco took, but Lena's steadiness. The junior medic, Yusuf, started watching her hands when she worked. He'd noticed she never fumbled, never wasted motion. Even in panic, she moved like the panic had to keep up with her. Sana noticed something else. Lena's file was thin in a way that felt deliberate. Her credentials were valid, her licenses checked but her employment history had gaps, not suspicious gaps, sanitized gaps, like someone had swept the trail clean. And there were small breadcrumbs. A scar at the base of Lena's thumb, old, precise, like a burn from repeated friction. Calluses in places nurses didn't usually have them. A habit of lowering her voice when she said certain words, coordinates, distances, time. Once, when a new security contractor did a drill, Lena corrected his stance without thinking. "Your weight is wrong," she'd said, then caught herself. The contractor had laughed, "And you know that how, nurse?" Lena had simply shrugged. "I watch people." Marco, overhearing, had smirked. "She watches too much, that's her problem." But Sana had filed it away. Because Sana knew people with hidden histories. The border did that to you. Then came the day the high-status patient arrived. It was late afternoon, the sun low and dusty, when a convoy rolled in faster than it should have been allowed. SUVs with tinted windows, men in civilian clothes wearing earpieces, the kind of presence that made everyone straighten without being told. They carried in a man who looked like he belonged in a boardroom, not a stretcher. His name, whispered like a secret, was Farid Demir. Not just a businessman, not just a diplomat. A negotiator. A bridge between agencies, donors, and decisions that determined whether this hospital stayed open or became another abandoned tent in the dust. In other words, power in human form. He'd been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, an attack on a road. The details were kept vague, but the urgency was clear. Marco took over like it was his personal stage. He barked orders, demanded labs, insisted on privacy. His eyes shone with the opportunity. Sana tried to assign Lena to the case. Marco refused. "I need my best people," he'd said, which in his mouth meant people I control. Sana's jaw had tightened. "Lena is my best people." Marco had smiled thinly. "Then keep her on the floor, she's useful there." Lena had heard, of course she had. She hadn't reacted. But later, as she passed Farid's guarded bay, she'd paused for half a second. Farid's eyes had found hers, tired assessing. And he had whispered something in Arabic, so soft it barely moved his lips. "Lena." Not nurse, not hey, her name. Lena had stopped. Their gazes locked. She didn't answer out loud. But her face changed, just a fraction, like a door inside her had clicked. Then she moved on, expression back to neutral, and the moment vanished. Sana saw it. And Sana knew. Something was coming. Pause. Drop a comment right here, just one word. Door. Because the second Farid recognized her, the story quietly shifted, and I want to know if you felt that click too. The first crisis came 3 nights later. Night shifts in the field hospital had their own rhythm. The day brought planned surgeries, scheduled supply drops, visiting officials. The night brought what the border always brought, the unexpected. That night the intake started with 2 patients, routine compared to what they'd seen. A fractured arm. A feverish child in a nearby civilian camp, handled off-site, not in the main tent, because the hospital policy was strict about minors in conflict zones. Lena did her rounds, adjusted drips, checked oxygen, updated the whiteboard with bed statuses. Sana stood at the nurse's station sipping tea that had gone cold twice. At 02:13 the lights flickered. The generator stuttered. A low murmur ran through the ward like an animal sensing a storm. "Not again," Yusuf muttered, tapping the monitor. Then the radio crackled, security channel urgent. Unidentified vehicles approaching from the North Road. No transponder, multiple. Sana's spine straightened, "Call it in." The radio operator's voice came back strained. "Command S not responding, the line S." Static swallowed the words. A second later, the perimeter alarm blared, thin, desperate, too loud in the quiet night. Lena was already moving. She didn't run, she didn't shout. She simply went to the narc cabinet and locked it, the exact instruction she'd given earlier in the hook, because some instincts don't wait for permission. She checked the crash cart seal, she scanned the staff count, she looked at the doors. Yusuf watched her like she'd become a compass. Sana stepped close. Lena. Lena's answer was immediate. We need to move patients away from the outer wall, and we need a secondary triage point in the back corridor. Sana hesitated, only because she was used to being the one giving the call. Then she nodded once. Do it. They started repositioning beds, pulling curtains, guiding conscious patients inward with soft, firm words. The sound of vehicles grew louder, engines, brakes, then silence. That silence was worse, because engines stopping meant people getting out. Marco burst into the tent from the surgery annex, hair rumpled, eyes hot with irritation. What is happening? He snapped. Sana said, perimeter breach risk, lockdown protocol. Marco scoffed. This is a hospital, they won't. A crack cut him off. Not a gunshot this time. The unmistakable sound of a metal gate giving way under force. Then shouting, boots, a command in Arabic that wasn't Turkish security. Lena's eyes flicked to Marco. Get your surgeons away from the entrances. Marco's pride flared. Stop telling me. Another crack closer, a scream outside cut short. Marco's mouth closed. His hands, those brilliant hands, hovered uncertainly. For the first time, the man who always seemed in control looked like a guest in his own body. And Lena stepped forward, not toward danger but toward function. She grabbed the portable radio. It was dead, no signal, jammed or out of range. She went to the corner where the supply crates were stacked and pulled one open with practiced speed. Inside were trauma supplies, bandages, IV kits. But she didn't take those. She took a small item wrapped in cloth, the kind of thing you didn't inventory on public lists. Sana noticed and frowned. What is that? Lena met her eyes. Insurance. Before Sana could ask, the entrance flap tore open. Armed insurgents flooded the threshold, and the air inside the tent went tight like a held breath. They weren't a ragtag group. They moved with discipline. Two covered the room. One scanned faces like he was searching for someone specific. Another went straight for the radio desk. No signal, the radio operator protested. We can't. The insurgent backhanded him. Not hard enough to break bones, but enough to establish the rule. Marco started forward, outraged. Hey, this is... A rifle swung toward him. Marco stopped. A man stepped in behind them, heavier footsteps, authority without needing to raise his voice. He wore no insignia, but his presence was command. His eyes were cold, assessing, and he had the controlled calm of someone used to rooms going silent when he entered. Where is Farid Demir? He asked in Turkish, clear and confident. Sana swallowed. This is a medical facility, we have many patients. The man's gaze moved over her like she was air. Then it landed on Marco. You're the doctor, he said. Marco's throat worked. I am a surgeon. Good, the man replied. Then you will keep Farid Demir alive. The stretcher appeared behind him, pushed in by two men with rifles slung. Farid lay on it, breathing shallowly, his suit jacket cut open, chest bandaged. The scent of antiseptic and sweat clung to him. His eyes were open. And when they swept the room, they found Lena immediately. Not because she stood out. Because she didn't flinch. Farid's gaze held hers, and his lips parted. He didn't say her name this time, not out loud. But his eyes did. The insurgent leader saw the look. His gaze snapped to Lena. You, he said in Arabic, night nurse. Lena's pulse stayed steady. Yes. You will assist. Marco started to protest. She is not. The leader cut him off with a glance. You will not decide what she is. And that was the moment the room changed. Not because Lena had done anything dramatic. Because the man with a rifle had just given her a role Marco couldn't deny. They moved Farid onto a bed. Marco began assessing, hands finally finding purpose, but his voice trembled as he called for supplies. Lena was already there, handing him what he needed before he asked. Gauze, saline, a clean clamp. Marco blinked at her, thrown off by her timing. How did you? Because you always reach for the same thing next, Lena said, tone flat. The insurgents watched everything. Two stood at the entrance, rifles angled down but ready. Another paced like a caged animal eyeing cabinets. The leader leaned close to Marco. If he dies, you die. Marco's face went gray. Lena leaned in and spoke to Farid in Arabic, low enough that only he could hear. Don't talk, she murmured. Save your breath. Farid's eyelids fluttered. You. Later, Lena said. Marco glanced up sharply. What did he say? He's conscious, Lena answered, giving nothing away. As Marco worked, a complication hit. Farid's breathing became shallow, his oxygen saturation dropping. The monitor beeped faster, anxious. Marco cursed softly, his airway. Lena moved without waiting. She adjusted Farid's position, lifted his chin, cleared the line, checked the seal on the oxygen mask with a precision that looked almost military. The saturation climbed. Marco stared, genuinely startled. You've done this before, he whispered, not accusation, now recognition. Lena didn't answer. Outside, another burst of shouting. A crash. Someone in the hospital staff cried out. One insurgent at the entrance turned his head toward the noise. His rifle dipped for half a second. And Lena's eyes tracked it like a measurement. She wasn't staring at the weapon with fascination. She was cataloging risk. Sana edged closer to Lena, voy. See, barely audible, what is happening? Lena didn't look away from Farid. They're not here for medicine. No, Sana agreed, throat tight. They're here for him. Lena's fingers pressed gently to Farid's wrist, counting his pulse like she was counting seconds. Then she said softly, to no one and everyone, if they take him out of here, he won't make it. The insurgent leader heard her anyway. He stepped closer. He will make it, he said. You will make him. Lena lifted her gaze and met his eyes fully. Not if you move him, not if you force this. The leader's jaw tightened. You challenge me, nurse. I'm telling you reality, Lena replied. Reality doesn't care about your rifle. A dangerous silence. Marco looked like he expected Lena to be struck. Instead, the leader stared at her for a long moment, then turned away, barking orders to his men in Arabic. Two men moved to secure the outer corridor. And that was the first undeniable proof to the witnesses in the tent. Lena could speak to power without shaking. Not because she was reckless, because she sounded like she'd spoken to worse. Pause. If you want the moment when everyone's assumptions about Lena finally collapse in a way you can almost hear, hit like on this video right now. Because the next shift in this story doesn't happen with a gunshot. It happens with a single sentence said in the wrong tone to the wrong person. The competence reveal didn't come as a heroic montage. It came as a sequence of small, razor-clean decisions under pressure. Farid's condition was unstable. Marco tried to manage the medical side, but his fear of the insurgents made his hands slightly off. Subtle hesitations, unnecessary checks, tiny stutters that cost time. Lena compensated without making it obvious. When Marco reached for the wrong medication concentration, Lena corrected it with a quiet, that one's diluted. When he almost contaminated a sterile field because his eyes flicked to a rifle, Lena stepped in, repositioned the tray, and anchored the moment without calling attention to it. When an insurgent got too close and brushed a hanging IV line, Lena turned and said calmly, "Step back. You'll pull the catheter out." The man scoffed, but he stepped back anyway. Because she didn't plead. She stated. Outside, the hospital's small security team, undertrained, under-equipped, tried to contain the breach. The insurgents weren't there to massacre, they were there for control. And control doesn't require chaos, it requires fear. They cut communications, they blocked exits, they rounded staff into visible clusters. A nurse started crying. A translator trembled so badly he dropped a clipboard. Lena kept her voice low, her hands steady. Then an insurgent entered the tent with a tablet and a satellite phone, speaking urgently to the leader. Lena caught a fragment of Arabic. Convoy delayed, checkpoint military. The leader's eyes narrowed. He didn't like delays, he didn't like uncertainty. His gaze snapped to Farid. How long? Marco hesitated because medicine doesn't give guarantees. We need time, he needs stabilization, maybe surgery. The leader's patience thinned. No surgery, we move in 30 minutes. Marco's mouth opened, panic flaring. If you move him in 30 minutes, he... A rifle clicked, just a sound, but it was enough to shut him down. Lena stepped in, voice calm. 30 minutes is possible if you let us work. The leader looked at her like she'd volunteered to hold a storm still. Possible, he repeated. Yes, Lena said, but your men need to stop pacing. The vibration, the noise, it's raising stress, raising his pressure. That wasn't strictly medical in the way Marco thought medicine worked. But it was true. And the leader surprisingly gestured again. Quiet. His men slowed. Marco stared at Lena. What are you doing? Buying time, Lena murmured without looking at him. Buying time for what Marco didn't understand. Sana did, because Lena had quietly slipped that cloth-wrapped insurance item into her scrub pocket earlier, and Sana had seen just enough to recognize it wasn't medical. But Sana also knew better than to ask in front of rifles. At 02:34, Farid's blood pressure dipped sharply. The monitor's beeps spaced out, slower, more ominous. Marco's face tightened. He's bleeding internally. The leader stepped forward. Fix it. Marco's hands hovered again. We can't confirm without imaging, we don't have. Lena's voice cut through, soft but firm. We can confirm by symptoms. He's pale, pressure dropping, heart rate compensating. Marco. Marco flinched at hearing his name from her mouth, like she'd touched his rank. What? He snapped. His dressing, Lena said. It's clean, the bleeding isn't external, we need to maintain perfusion, start the second line. Marco stared. I know that. Then do it, Lena replied. Marco's pride warred with his fear, but the medicine won. He started the Seco. ND line. His hands were skilled, but they shook. Lena steadied the patient's arm with a grip that didn't waver. In that grip was the second breadcrumb, strength and control that didn't match, just a nurse. Farid's eyes flickered open wider. He whispered something in Arabic again, one word this time. Sniper. Marco's head snapped up. What did he say? Lena's gaze locked on Farid's. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes went distant for half a heartbeat. Then she said to Marco, he said water, he's thirsty. Farid blinked slowly, like he understood the lie and accepted it. The insurgent leader heard none of this. But Sana heard the word faintly. And Sana's face tightened in confusion. Because why would a wounded negotiator whisper, sniper, to a night nurse? The answer sat hidden in Lena's pocket, in her posture, in the way her eyes measured the room. But no one had the full picture yet. Not until the injustice arrived. Pause. Before we step into the part of this story that will make you want to reach through the screen and shake someone by the collar, subscribe if you're not already. Because the worse the injustice gets, the sweeter the vindication is going to feel when it finally lands. The insurgents kept the hospital under their grip for nearly an hour. They moved like they had a plan, but the plan kept slipping, because medicine is unpredictable and because they hadn't expected the staff to be as stubbornly professional as they were. Or maybe they hadn't expected Lena. Farid stabilized barely. His blood pressure rose, then held. His breathing evened enough that Marco could stop visibly panicking. The leader checked his satellite phone again and cursed. More Arabic, more impatience. Then a new sound came from outside, a distant rotor thump. A helicopter. Not close enough to see, but close enough to feel in the chest. The insurgents froze, listening. The leader's eyes narrowed. They found us. He turned to his men. Move now. Marco stepped forward, desperate. You can't move him now, he. The leader shoved Marco back with one hand, not brutal but humiliating. You don't tell me can't. Marco stumbled, his cheeks burned. Lena stepped in between them, not aggressive, just present. You move him, he dies, she said. The leader's eyes locked on her. And if I stay, I die, so choose who dies, nurse. Lena didn't blink. You're assuming you only have those choices. A beat of silence. Then the leader leaned closer, voice low, dangerous. I don't like riddles. Lena's voice stayed even. Then don't force me to speak in them. For a moment, it looked like he might strike her. Sana tensed, Yusuf held his breath. Marco watched, stunned, because he'd never seen someone talk to armed authority like this without breaking. Then outside, the helicopter sound grew louder. The leader snarled a command. His men grabbed the stretcher. Farid's eyes went wide, fear cutting through the pain. He looked at Lena again, pleading without words. Lena's hand pressed briefly to his shoulder. "Look at me," she murmured in Arabic. "Breathe." Then she turned to Sana. "Get everyone down now." Sana didn't question. She barked the order. Staff crouched behind beds, behind supply crates, behind anything that would break a line of sight. Marco hesitated, then crouched too, pride forgotten. The insurgents began to wheel Farid toward the exit. And that was when the injustice spike hit, not from the insurgents, but from within. Because at that exact moment, the hospital's contracted security team finally surged in through the back corridor, weapons drawn, old rifles, shaky hands, the desperate courage of people trying to undo a failure too late. Shots cracked, warning shots mostly, into the air and into the dirt outside, meant to scare the insurgents off without igniting a firefight inside a hospital. The insurgents fired back again, not to slaughter but to clear space. Chaos erupted in the corridor. Screams, footsteps slamming into canvas floorboards. And then someone yelled, "Who opened fire? Who did that?" The question came later, when the insurgents had retreated just enough to drag Farid into the shadows outside, using smoke and noise as cover. The helicopter's rotor thump grew into a roar, then faded, like it had turned away or been redirected. The insurgents vanished into the night with Farid. And the hospital was left trembling, half-lit, full of shaken staff and shattered calm. In the aftermath, Marco found his anger. Not at the insurgents. At Lena. He stormed toward the nurses' station where Lena was checking staff for injuries. "You lied," he hissed. Lena looked up. "About what?" "He said something," Marco snapped. "He said sniper, I heard it." Sana's head jerked toward Marco. "You heard that?" Marco ignored her. His eyes were bright with accusation, fueled by humiliation and fear seeking a target. "You've been acting like you're in charge," he said. "You've been undermining me all night, and now the patient is gone. You know what that means." Lena's expression stayed controlled. "It means insurgents took him." "It means an international negotiator was abducted from our facility," Marco shot back. "It means investigations, careers end, funding disappears, people get blamed." He leaned closer, voice sharp enough for others to hear. "And I'm not going to be the one blamed." The words hung like a threat. Sana stepped in, voice cold. "Marco, this is not the time." "It's exactly the time," Marco said loudly. "Because someone in this hospital gave them an advantage. Someone knew too much." Murmurs rose. Lena felt the shift, staff looking at her not with trust now, but with uncertainty. That uncertainty is how injustice starts. Marco turned, scanning the room, making sure eyes were on him. "We had a breach. We had a high-value patient. And our night nurse, who has a suspicious file and a habit of giving tactical instructions, kept talking to them like she knew what she was doing." Yusuf's mouth fell open. Sana's eyes narrowed dangerously. Lena said nothing. Marco continued louder. "Security says someone moved supplies earlier. Someone locked the narc cabinet without orders. Someone created secondary triage points like this was a battlefield drill." Sana stepped forward. "Those decisions kept people alive." Marco pointed at her, and the patient still got taken. He turned back to Lena. "Where were you trained, Lena? Where did you learn to talk to armed men? Why did he recognize you?" The room went quiet. Lena's voice was soft. "I'm a nurse." Marco laughed once, bitter. "That's not an answer." Sana said, "Enough." Marco ignored her again. "I'm filing an incident report," he announced. "I'm requesting Lena Sayegh be suspended pending investigation." A sharp intake of breath ran through the staff. Suspended. In this environment, suspension wasn't just a job risk. It was a safety risk. It meant being exposed, unprotected, vulnerable. Lena's face stayed calm, but Sana saw her hands, just for a moment, curl into fists. Then Lena relaxed them again, like she'd practiced restraint until it became muscle memory. "Do what you need," Lena said. Marco sneered, "I will." He turned and strode away, leaving a wake of whispers. Sana grabbed Lena's arm, pulling her into a supply alcove. "What did he mean?" Sana demanded in a whisper. "About your file, about Farid recognizing you." Lena's eyes stayed steady. "Sana, not here." "Lena," Sana insisted, voice cracking. "They're going to sacrifice you." Lena exhaled slowly. "Let them try." Sana stared at her. "Why are you so calm?" Lena's gaze flicked toward the canvas wall, where distant shouts still echoed. "Because I've been blamed before," Lena said quietly, "and I learned what survives it." Pause. If you've ever watched someone do everything right and still get painted as the problem, comment, "Still standing," below. Because the next part is where Lena's dignity gets tested in front of people who don't deserve her patience. By morning, the field hospital had become a hive of nervous energy. The breach wasn't public yet, not officially, but secrets like this in a border zone don't stay secret. Radios buzzed, phones, when they worked, lit up with messages. Staff spoke in low voices, eyes darting. Marco was everywhere, performing competence for anyone watching. He called the NGO regional director. He drafted reports. He demanded a staff meeting. He framed the night like a story where he'd been the heroic surgeon besieged by insurgents, betrayed by internal failures, endangered by unusual staff. And Lena was the easiest, unusual to point at. At the meeting, Marco stood in front of the whiteboard, sleeves rolled up like a man ready for hard truths. Sana stood to the side, arms crossed, eyes burning. Lena sat near the back, posture straight, hands folded. Marco began, voice measured. "We will be investigated, that is certain, and the worst thing we can do is pretend everything was normal." He paced. "We have to account for vulnerabilities. The breach happened too smoothly. Communication was cut. They knew where to go." He stopped and looked directly at Lena. "I have raised concerns about Nurse Sayeg's conduct." The room shifted again. Marco continued, tone almost regretful. "I respect nurses, I do, but we cannot ignore anomalies. She issued tactical orders without authorization. She communicated with the insurgent leader in Arabic with unusual confidence, and the patient, Farid Demir, appeared to recognize her." Murmurs. A junior doctor whispered, "Maybe she knew them." Someone else muttered, "Don't say that." Marco held up a hand as if he was the voice of reason. "I am not accusing. I am asking for caution, for protocol." Sana snapped, "You are absolutely accusing." Marco turned to her with practiced calm. "Sana, you're emotionally involved." Sana's lips arted in disbelief. Emotionally involved, she kept this hospital from turning into a slaughterhouse. Marco's eyes hardened. "And still the high-value patient was abducted. Our donors will ask why. Our partners will ask why. The authorities will ask why." He leaned forward slightly, "And they will want a name." Silence, heavy, ugly silence. Lena spoke then, voice even. "I did my job." Marco smiled thinly. "Did you?" Lena's gaze didn't waver. "Yes." Marco's smile faded. "Then you won't mind being placed on administrative leave." Sana shot forward. "No." Marco raised his voice. "It's temporary, it's procedural." Sana looked around the room. "You all know her, you all watched her last night. Are you really going to let him do this?" People avoided her eyes. Not because they believed Marco. Because fear makes cowards of good people. Lena's jaw tightened once. Then she stood. The tent felt smaller with her standing, like she'd become a pillar everyone had been leaning on without realizing. "If the hospital needs to show cooperation," Lena said, "then I will step aside. But I want it on record that I followed nursing protocol and that my actions reduced risk to staff." Marco exhaled like he'd won. "Fine." Lena turned to Sana. "It's okay." "It's not," Sana hissed, voice shaking. Lena's eyes softened. "Sana, I need you to stay here. They'll need you when this gets worse." Sana stared at her. "Worse?" Lena didn't answer. She gathered her things quietly, a small bag, her ID, her notebook. As she left, Yusuf stood abruptly. "Nurse Lena." Lena paused, looking back. Yusuf swallowed. You saved me last night. Lena nodded once, then keep your head down and watch the doors. Yusuf nodded, terrified and loyal. Lena walked out of the main tent into the harsh morning light. Security escorted her, not like a criminal but like a liability. A woman in scrubs being walked away from a hospital she'd held together. Humiliation doesn't always look like insults. Sometimes it looks like silence. And that silence followed her to the small administrative container where they told her to wait. No phone, the security supervisor said awkwardly, until the inquiry. Lena sat on a metal chair. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She stared at the wall, listening to the world outside. And after 15 minutes, a new sound approached, boots measured, confident. A door opened. A man stepped in wearing a clean uniform that didn't belong to the hospital. His insignia was discreet but unmistakable. Turkish military liaison. He looked at Lena as if he already knew exactly who she was. "Ms. Sayegh," he said politely, "you've caused quite a storm." Lena's eyes lifted slowly. "I didn't start it." The man's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "No, but you're at the center." He pulled out a chair and sat opposite her. "My name is Colonel Sem Arslan," he said. "I'm here on behalf of several interested parties." Lena didn't react. Colonel Arslan studied her, then said, "Farid Demir has been taken. That has consequences." "I know," Lena said. "Do you?" His tone sharpened. "Because this is bigger than a hospital incident report." Lena's voice stayed calm. "Then why are you talking to me?" Colonel Arslan leaned back slightly. "Because Farid Demir requested you by name." Lena's face still didn't change, but her eyes, just for a fraction, tightened. Colonel Arslan noticed. "He did it before he was moved," he said. "Find Lena." Silence stretched. Then Colonel Arslan said, carefully, "We also found something in your background checks that the NGO paperwork doesn't mention." Lena's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. "What?" she asked softly. Colonel Arslan slid a folder across the table. On the front was a red stamp and a code. "Not NGO. Military." Lena didn't open it. She didn't need to. Colonel Arslan said, "You were trained not as a nurse." He paused. "As a marksman." The word sat heavy in the air, dangerous and unbelievable. Lena exhaled slowly. And Colonel Arslan continued, "The insurgents who breached this hospital, they're not just random. They're part of a cell that has been hunting Farid Demir for months." He leaned forward, eyes sharp. "So tell me, Lena, why did they not shoot him in the road? Why take him alive?" Lena's gaze lifted fully now, and for the first time, Colonel Arslan saw something in her eyes that matched the file. A cold, clear focus. "Because they think he knows something," Lena said. Colonel Arslan nodded. "And do you know what he knows?" Lena's voice dropped. "I know what he carries." Colonel Arslan's eyebrows rose. "Carries." Lena finally opened the folder, flipped one page, then closed it again like it was a memory she didn't want to touch. "He's not just a negotiator," Lena said. "He's a courier." Colonel Arslan's face hardened. "For what?" Lena's answer came like a confession and a warning. "A list," she said. "Names corruptio. And the kind of names that make governments move quietly." Colonel Arslan stared at her. And that was the moment the authority intervention truly entered the story. Not to punish Lena. To recruit her. Pause. If you want the full truth of who Lena really is, and why the title isn't just a twist but a promise, tap subscribe now. Because from here on out, the story isn't about whether she can survive humiliation. It's about whether the people who underestimated her can survive being wrong. Colonel Arslan didn't explain everything at once. He didn't have to. He asked questions like a man building a case. "Where did Farid recognize you from?" he asked. Lena looked past him, as if choosing which memories to release. "Beirut," she said finally, "years ago." Colonel Arslan waited. Lena continued, voice controlled. "I worked with a medical unit during an evacuation corridor. Farid was facilitating movement, quietly. He saved people by making calls no one else could make." "That doesn't explain sniper," Colonel Arslan said. Lena's jaw flexed, because I wasn't only medical. Silence. Colonel Arslan's voice softened slightly. You were a shooter. Lena didn't correct him, but she also didn't glorify it. I was a protection asset, Lena said. I covered corridors, I kept people from being ambushed, I did it so the medics could do their jobs. Colonel Arslan studied her, and you left. Yes. Why? Lena's eyes dropped. Because one night I missed something, not a shot, a person. The emotion line came, brief and clean, like the script's own heartbeat. And that's when the room changed, Lena said quietly, almost to herself. Colonel Arslan didn't press for details. Instead, he said, we have a chance to recover Farid, but we need leverage. Lena looked up. What kind? Colonel Arslan's gaze was steady. The insurgents don't know who you are, they think you're a night nurse. Lena's mouth twitched, not humor, irony. Colonel Arslan continued, and they will assume you are disposable, which makes you useful. Sana would have cursed him for saying it that way. Lena simply nodded once. What do you need? Colonel Arslan slid a second folder across the table, this one thinner with photos. Faces, men, locations. A map of the area with circles drawn around likely routes. But Lena didn't study the map like a soldier eager for action. She studied it like a clinician studying symptoms. Time, Lena asked. Hours, Colonel Arslan said, not days. Lena exhaled. Then we need to stop Marco. Colonel Arslan blinked. Marco. He's going to make me the scapegoat, Lena said. And in doing that, he'll contaminate the hospital's cooperation. Staff will stop trusting each other. That will slow everything down. Colonel Arslan leaned back. Your priority is your reputation. Lena's eyes hardened slightly. My priority is the hospital. If they fracture it, people die, and Farid dies. Colonel Arslan's gaze sharpened. So you want public justice? I want procedural justice, Lena corrected. Documented, witnessed, chain of command. Colonel Arslan's mouth twitched again. You've learned how institutions work. I learned how they fail, Lena said. Colonel Arslan stood. Then we'll do both. We'll recover Farid and we'll correct your record. He walked to the door, then paused. One more thing, he said without turning. If it comes to it, can you still do what you were trained to do? The question hung there, dangerous, loaded. Lena answered carefully. I can do what is necessary to protect life. Colonel Arslan nodded once, satisfied, and left. Lena sat alone again, breathing slowly. Outside, the hospital hummed with fear. Inside, Lena's calm was not weakness. It was restraint, because she knew the reveal was coming. And when it came, it would not be gentle. Pause, quickly before the next turn hits. Hit like if you want to see Marco confronted the way he deserves. Not with shouting, but with receipts, witnesses, and a chain of command that doesn't care about his ego. The authority intervention didn't happen in a dramatic storming of the tent. It happened like real accountability often does. Quietly at first. 2 hours after Lena's suspension, Colonel Arslan walked into the field hospital with 3 people behind him. One wore NGO administration credentials, regional director, crisp shirt, eyes tired. One wore internal affairs insignia, medical compliance. And the last wore plain clothes, but moved like someone who had spent a lifetime making rooms obey. Intelligence liaison. They didn't announce themselves like conquerors. They asked to see logs. They asked to see footage, what little existed. They asked to see Marco. Marco, of course, assumed they were there to praise him. He met them with a firm handshake and an expression that said he was ready to lead them through his hospital. Colonel, Marco said with a tight smile, thank you for responding. As you know, we W. Air breached. Colonel Arslan held up a hand. I know. Marco blinked, thrown off by the lack of interest in his narrative. The NGO director, a woman named Elise Hartman, looked at Marco without warmth. We're here to understand what happened, not to be briefed like donors. Marco's cheeks reddened slightly. Of course, we have a suspect. Elise's eyes narrowed. I heard you suspended Lena Sayegh. Marco's spine stiffened. Administrative leave, temporary, procedural. The compliance officer, Dr. Nader Qasim, asked calmly, "On what grounds?" Marco began listing his points, confident now that authority was in the room. Tactical behavior, unusual communication, possible prior association with the abducted patient. Colonel Arslan watched him like a man watching a trap being set. Dr. Qasim held up a finger. "We will need documentation, specific incidents, names of witnesses." Marco nodded. "I can provide that." Elise asked, "And what about your own conduct? Any protocol deviations?" Marco bristled. "I did what was required." Colonel Arslan's voice cut in softly. "Did you?" Marco turned to him, surprised. "Colonel." Colonel Arslan's gaze was steady. "We have preliminary statements from staff. They describe a nurse who coordinated protective measures while you argued about authority." Marco's mouth opened. Colonel Arslan continued. "They describe you attempting to move into confrontation with armed men, which escalates risk in a medical environment." Marco sputtered. Those are interpretations. People were scared. They don't understand." Dr. Qasim asked, "Did you ever instruct the staff to lock narcotics, to relocate patients away from entrances, to establish secondary triage?" Marco hesitated. Sana, standing nearby, spoke up. "No, he did not." Marco whipped around. "Sana." Elise held up a hand again. "We're collecting facts." Sana's voice was firm. "Lena did those things, and she saved time. She kept people calm." Marco's eyes flashed. "She overstepped." Dr. Qasim asked, "Did her actions result in patient harm?" Marco's jaw tightened. "The patient was abducted." Dr. Qasim nodded slowly. "By insurgents, that is not the same as harm caused by nursing conduct." Marco's voice rose. "You're missing the point. We need to show we are not compromised." Colonel Arslan's tone turned colder. "Then we should not compromise ourselves by scapegoating the wrong person." Marco froze. Elise's gaze sharpened. "Where is Lena now?" Marco said, "In administrative hold." Elise turned to a staff member. "Bring her back immediately." Marco's face went rigid. "You can't just..." Elise's voice cut like steel. "I can. I run the funding that keeps this hospital open." Marco swallowed. His power suddenly wasn't absolute. And that was the second time the room changed. Pause. If you're enjoying the way authority is stepping in here, quietly, professionally, and with no patience for ego, subscribe now. Because the reveal isn't going to be a flashy confession. It's going to be a truth that lands like a gavel. They brought Lena back to the main tent in the late morning. She walked in with 2 security escorts and the same calm expression she'd worn all night, even with rifles pointed at her. The staff saw her and straightened subtly, like a spine returning to alignment. Marco watched her with a mixture of resentment and unease. He'd expected her to come in defensive, pleading. Instead, she looked like she'd been waiting. Elise gestured to a chair. "Ms. Sayegh, sit." Lena sat. Dr. Qasim asked, "We have questions about last night." Lena nodded. "I will answer within patient confidentiality and staff safety." Marco scoffed softly. "Listen to her, she thinks she's a lawyer." Colonel Arslan turned his head slightly. "Marco, shut up." Dr. Qasim began. "Did Farid Demir recognize you?" Lena answered honestly but carefully. "Yes." A murmur. Marco pounced. That's." Elise held up a hand. "Let her finish." Lena continued. "I encountered him during humanitarian work years ago." Marco snapped. "Where? With what organization?" Lena looked at him. "An organization that doesn't put its staff at risk by advertising details." Marco's face reddened. "Convenient." Colonel Arslan spoke. "Dr. Vukovic, we are not here for your commentary." Marco clenched his jaw. Dr. Qasim asked, "Did you communicate with the insurgents?" Lena nodded. "Yes." Marco leaned forward. "In Arabic." Lena met Dr. Qasim's eyes. "I speak Arabic, many staff do." Dr. Qasim nodded. "What did you say?" Lena answered, "I told them to move back from sterile areas. I asked them to reduce movement around the patient. I provided basic medical constraints." Dr. Qasim asked, "Did you provide them tactical information, exits, staff locations, security positions. Lena's voice was firm. No. Marco laughed sharply, and we're supposed to just believe that. Sana's voice cut in. We watched her, she did not. What? Elise turned to staff. Who else can corroborate? Yusuf raised his hand, trembling but determined. I can. He swallowed, eyes darting to Marco, then back to Elise. Nurse Lena told us to move patients away from the wall. She locked the narc cabinet. She told us to keep quiet. She kept people calm. Dr. Qasim asked, did any of her actions increase risk? Yusuf shook his head. No, they helped. Marco's voice sharpened, and yet the patient was taken. Lena looked at him. Because we were breached by armed men, not because I suggested moving beds. Marco slammed his hand on the table. You don't get to talk to me like that. Colonel Arslan's tone dropped. She can talk however she likes when she is telling the truth. The tent went silent. Marco stared at the colonel. Excuse me. Colonel Arslan looked around the room. We are not doing theater, we are doing accountability. He turned to Lena. Ms. Sayegh, there is a question we have not asked yet because it is sensitive. Lena's gaze stayed steady. Ask it. Colonel Arslan said, were you ever trained in weapons? The air in the tent changed instantly. Sana's breath caught. Yusuf's eyes widened. Even Elise's expression tightened. Marco's face lit with vindictive satisfaction. Ah. Lena didn't look away. Yes, she said. The word landed like a dropped instrument. A few staff members murmured, shocked. Marco leaned back smug, so I was right. Lena turned her head toward him slowly. No, you were afraid, that's not the same thing. Marco's smile faltered. Colonel Arslan continued, voice controlled. Were you trained as a sniper? The title's promise hung in the air now, no longer metaphor. Lena's voice was quiet. Yes. And that's when the room changed. Pause. If that reveal just hit you the way it hit everyone in that tent, take a second to comment, I knew it. Or no way. Because from here on out, every earlier moment snaps into focus, and the justice part of this story is about to get very, very real. The reveal didn't turn Lena into a superhero. It turned her into a person with context. Elise's voice was careful. Why are you here as a nurse? Lena looked at her. Because I chose it. Dr. Qasim asked, and your weapons training, was it official, military, intelligence? Lena's eyes flicked briefly to Colonel Arslan, then back. It was official, and it ended. Marco couldn't help himself. So you admit you lied on your application? Lena's gaze sharpened. I did not. I disclosed what I was required to disclose through secure channels. The NGO verified it. Elise looked startled. You disclosed this? Colonel Arslan said calmly, to the appropriate authorities, not to gossip. Marco's jaw tightened. This is outrageous, a trained sniper working in a hospital. Lena interrupted softly. Do you know what a sniper is, Marco? Marco scoffed, someone who shoots people. Lena's voice stayed clinical. A sniper is someone trained to see without being seen, to hold breath under pressure, to wait, to make one decision correctly because there will not be a second chance. She leaned forward slightly. Now tell me, does that sound like a useless skill in a trauma ward? Silence. Because everyone knew the answer. Dr. Qasim asked, did you bring any weapon into this facility? No, Lena said, never. Sana exhaled, relief crossing her face. Marco pounced on the opening anyway. Then why did the patient whisper sniper to you? Lena's eyes softened, just a fraction. Because Farid knew what the insurgents didn't. Marco narrowed his eyes, which is. Lena looked at Elise, then at Dr. Qasim, then finally around the room at staff who had watched her be humiliated in slow motion. He knew, Lena said, that if the hospital was breached, I would not freeze. She paused. He also knew, Lena continued, that someone might try to blame me, and he wanted you to find me before that story became permanent. Elise swallowed. He anticipated this. Lena nodded once. People like Farid survive by anticipating. Colonel Arslan stepped forward. And Farid Demir is not simply a negotiator. He is carrying information that threatens a network. That is why they took him alive. Marco looked between them, suddenly out of his depth. You're saying this is political? Colonel Arslan's gaze was cold. Everything here is political. You just pretend it isn't when it benefits you. Marco bristled. So what now? Are you going to turn this hospital into a military site? Elise answered, voice firm. No, but we are going to correct the injustice you initiated. She turned to Dr. Kassem. Record, Lena Sayegh is reinstated immediately. Any suspension is void. Sana's shoulders sagged with relief. Lena didn't smile. Vindication hadn't arrived yet, not fully. Because Marco still stood there, unpunished, still wearing authority like he deserved it. And Lena wanted justice that was more than a reversal. Procedural document. Ted consequences. Elise turned to Marco. Dr. Vukovic, you will also be formally reviewed for misconduct and for creating a hostile work environment under crisis conditions. Marco's face went pale. What that's? Dr. Kassem said calmly, you publicly suggested a staff member was compromised without evidence. In a conflict zone, that can be lethal. Marco stammered, I was being cautious. Colonel Arslan's voice was low. You were being cowardly. Marco's eyes flashed. Excuse me. Colonel Arslan stepped closer, gaze unwavering. You needed a name to offer fear. You chose the one person who held the line while you froze. Marco looked around, seeking support. No one met his eyes. Not even the junior doctors who had laughed at his jokes before. Because once the truth is spoken in front of authority, it becomes harder to pretend. And that's when the public justice began, not with yelling but with signatures. Pause. If you've stayed with this story to this point, do me a favor. Subscribe right now so you don't lose the thread. Because the next act isn't about the twist anymore. It's about the consequences, and watching them unfold is the most satisfying part. Elise ordered immediate documentation. Statements were taken from Sana, Yusuf, the radio operator, and any staff who had been present. Marco's incident report was examined line by line. And the deeper they looked, the uglier it became. Marco had omitted details that made him look indecisive. He had exaggerated Lena's tactical actions, painting them as suspicious rather than protective. He had failed to mention that he'd initially refused to let Lena assist Farid because of ego, not protocol. These weren't criminal acts. They were worse in a way. They were the kind of bureaucratic manipulation that destroys good people quietly. Dr. Kassem spoke to Marco privately, but the consequences were public enough to be undeniable. Marco was removed from lead duty pending review. A replacement trauma lead was requested. Marco's access to sensitive patient cases was restricted. The staff saw it happen. They saw the man who'd made them feel small being made accountable by procedures he'd tried to weaponize. And that accountability spread through the hospital like oxygen, something people didn't realize they were starving for until it returned. Marco tried to salvage his dignity. He confronted Lena near the supply corridor. His voice was low, furious. You planned this. Lena looked at him, expression steady. I didn't plan your choices. Marco's eyes narrowed. You think you're better than everyone because you have some secret past. Lena's voice stayed quiet. I think I'm responsible for what I do, that's all. Marco leaned closer, spitting the words like poison. You're dangerous. Lena's gaze held his. No, I'm disciplined, there's a difference. Marco flinched at the certainty in her tone. He stepped back, jaw clenched. And in that moment, Lena saw something in him she hadn't bothered to see before, fear. Not fear of insurgents. Fear of being ordinary. Fear of being exposed. Fear of a nurse being the one people trusted. Lena turned away, leaving him standing alone with his own insecurity. Because her attention was already elsewhere. Farid Demir was still out there. And Colonel Arslan had not brought her in to fix office politics. He had brought her in because there was a window, small, dangerous, shrinking. That afternoon, Lena stood in a smaller side tent with Colonel Arslan and the plainclothes liaison, a woman named Duria who spoke little but listened like a blade. They discussed routes, likely holding areas, and the insurgent cells' behavior patterns. Lena contributed not with how to shoot, not with tactics you could imitate, but with observation. They'll move him at night, Lena said. They'll avoid main roads, they'll keep him alive but pressured. They'll use him to negotiate, but they won't actually negotiate. Colonel Arslan nodded. Why? Because if the list gets out, Lena said, they lose, so they'll pretend they want a deal while they extract what they need. Durya asked, and what do they need? Lena's jaw tightened. A code phrase, a dead drop location, something Farid knows but hasn't given. Colonel Arslan asked, will he hold? Lena's voice was soft. Farid is stubborn. Durya studied Lena. You care about him. Lena didn't deny it. He saved lives. He saved mine once indirectly. Colonel Arslan said, then we recover him. He paused. And we do it without turning this hospital into a battlefield. Lena nodded, because she knew what the line was. And she would not cross it. Not here. Not with patients behind canvas walls. So the plan was built around containment, not combat. Tracking, not firefights. Authority, not chaos. And Lena's role, despite her past, was not to be a weapon. It was to be the person who could see the moment before it happened. Pause. If you want ending that doesn't rely on luck, but on competence and consequence, hit like. Because the final vindication in this story isn't just Lena being respected. It's her being believed when it matters most. By the second night, the hospital was under tighter security. Not militarized, but smarter. Perimeter patrols doubled. Communication redundancies were installed. Staff were briefed without panic. Sana watched Lena move through the ward again, back in scrubs, back in her quiet orbit. But something had changed. People looked at her differently. Not with suspicion. With awe. And awe is its own kind of distance. Yusuf approached Lena near the medication station, voice hushed. Is it true? Lena didn't look up from the vial she was labeling. Is what true? That you were, you know. Lena capped the vial. I was trained, I don't do that anymore. Yusuf swallowed. Why become a nurse? Lena paused, eyes briefly distant. Because, she said softly, a nurse doesn't decide who deserves care. Yusuf nodded slowly, absorbing something bigger than gossip. That night, just after midnight, Colonel Arslan returned with news. They de-intercepted a signal, a brief satellite ping. A location, approximate, in a cluster of abandoned buildings across the border, dangerous territory. Not a place you sent soldiers in loud. A place you approached like a whisper. They didn't ask Lena to carry a rifle. They asked her to identify, to confirm from distance whether Farid was there, to use her old skill without turning it into violence. It was a narrow ethical thread, and Lena walked it carefully. They drove out in an unmarked vehicle, stopping short of the location. Lena used optics, high-grade, controlled, legal through state channels. She watched the building through darkness. She didn't give instructions on how to shoot. She didn't talk about angles like a tutorial. She simply observed. 2 men at the entrance, one pacing on the roof. The pacing pattern matched impatience, not confidence. A window flickered. A silhouette moved inside, unsteady, guarded. Lena's breath slowed. She waited. Then, for half a second, the silhouette leaned into a strip of light. A familiar profile. Farid. Alive. Lena's chest tightened, relief sharp enough to hurt. She spoke into the radio softly. Confirmed, he's inside. Colonel Arslan's voice crackled back, controlled. Understood, stand by. Lena kept watching. And then she saw something that made her blood go cold. A third figure entered the frame, taller, posture wrong for insurgent. Not one of their men. Someone else. A man in a jacket with a hood, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged. He spoke to the rooftop guard. The guard nodded. The hooded man gestured toward the interior. A handoff. Not a negotiation. A transfer. Lena whispered into the radio. They're moving him. Another party just arrived. Colonel Arslan's voice sharpened. Can you identify? Lena focused, waiting for a sliver of light. The hooded man turned his head just enough. Lena's breath caught, because she recognized the face, not from the insurgent cell. From the hospital, from the day staff, a logistics coordinator who had access to supply routes, schedules, and staff rosters. A man named Raymai Haddad. And Lena realized in that instant why the breach had been so smooth. It hadn't just been force. It had been inside knowledge. And Marco's accusation, wrong in target, had not been wrong in existence. There was a compromise. Just not her. And that's when the room changed, Lena whispered, except this time it wasn't a room. It was the whole story. She spoke into the radio, voice low and controlled. Raymai Haddad is with them. Silence crackled. Then Colonel Arslan said, "Repeat." Lena repeated it. And the weight of that name traveled back through the radio like a verdict. Because now, the injustice wasn't only personal. It was operational. And it meant the public vindication would have to be even bigger. Pause. If you're the kind of person who loves when the story doesn't just expose the bully, but finds the real leak hiding in plain sight, comment, "Found you." Because what Lena just saw is about to trigger the most procedural, satisfying takedown you can imagine. They didn't rush in. Because rushing is how people die. Instead, Colonel Arslan moved like the authority he was. He initiated a containment operation, quietly. A legal intercept order was activated. Raymai's access was suspended in real time. The hospital's records were locked. A controlled arrest warrant was prepared through Turkish jurisdiction. And because they wanted the takedown to be undeniable, they didn't just grab Raymai in the dark. They waited until he returned. That was the hardest part for Lena. Waiting when she could see the danger. But waiting was what she'd been trained for. And she had promised herself she would only use her skill in service of life, not ego. At D. On, Raymai drove back into the hospital compound in a dusty pickup. He looked normal, tired, annoyed. He walked toward the admin container, pretending nothing was wrong. Colonel Arslan met him there with Elise, Dr. Kassem, and 2 uniformed military police. Raymai froze when he saw them. Elise spoke first, voice calm. "Raymai Haddad, we need you to answer questions about last night." Raymai tried to laugh. "Last night, I was asleep. I'm logistics, not." Colonel Arslan held up a tablet. On it was a still image, grainy but clear enough. Raymai's hooded face turned toward the light. Raymai's mouth opened, then closed. His eyes darted, searching for an exit. There wasn't one. Dr. Kassem said calmly, "You had access to patient schedules, security rotations, communications equipment." Elise added, "And you were in contact with unauthorized armed groups." Raymai's voice rose, defensive. "That's not this is." Colonel Arslan spoke quietly. "It is exactly what it looks like." Raymai's gaze snapped to Lena, who stood slightly behind the group, not triumphant, just present. Raymai's eyes narrowed, hatred sharpening his features. Her. The word was poison. "You're blaming her now?" Elise asked, incredulous. Raymai spat. "She's the one you should fear. She's not a nurse." Lena stepped forward slightly, voice controlled. "I never betrayed this hospital." Raymai sneered. "You think you're clean, you think you're better." Lena's gaze held his. "I think you sold people for access." Raymai's face twisted. "You don't understand what it takes to survive here." Lena's answer was quiet. "I understand more than you think." Military police moved in. Raymai tried to step back. Colonel Arslan's voice tightened. "Raymai Haddad, you are under arrest." Raymai's resistance lasted only seconds. Not because he was weak, but because the system around him was finally strong. They cuffed him. Staff watched from a distance, whispers spreading. The hospital saw with their own eyes that the real compromise wasn't the quiet night nurse. It was the smiling logistics man who knew everyone's schedule. And in that moment, Lena's vindication began to crystallize publicly. But Farid was still not home. Pause. If you've ever wanted to see a gotcha that isn't petty but actually protects people, hit like right now, because taking down Raymai is only half the justice. The other half is bringing Farid back alive. With Raymai detained, Colonel Arslan moved fast. Interrogation didn't need theatrics. They had enough evidence to pressure, enough leverage to bargain. Raymai cornered, offered information. Not out of remorse. Out of self-preservation. He gave them a route, a time, a planned transfer point where Farid would be moved from insurgent custody to a higher bidder. The higher bidder was the true threat, the one who wanted the list. They planned an intercept, but again, not a firefight. A controlled stop, legal authority, overwhelming presence. The handoff point was on a rural road near an abandoned checkpoint. 2 vehicles, one with Farid, one waiting to receive him. Colonel Arslan positioned forces out of sight, blocking exits without making it obvious. They let the vehicles arrive. They let the men step out. They let the handoff begin. Then floodlights snapped on, blinding white in the dawn haze. "Hands up," shouted a voice through a loudspeaker in Turkish and Arabic. "Drop weapons, you are surrounded." The men froze, startled. Some reached for rifles, but they were met not with immediate gunfire, but with a wall of armed authority. A standoff, tense and breathless. Lena watched from the command vehicle, heart pounding but face still. She didn't want bloodshed. She wanted Farid alive. One insurgent shouted something furious. Another tried to pull Farid forward as a shield. Colonel Arslan's voice came through the loudspeaker, calm as stone. "You will not use him, you will walk away." The insurgent leader, same man from the hospital, Lena recognized his posture, stepped forward, eyes scanning the perimeter. He realized he'd lost. He raised his hands slowly. Not surrender exactly. A calculation. They disarmed them carefully, methodically, without humiliation theatrics. Farid was pulled from the vehicle, weak, pale, but upright with help. His eyes scanned the scene, disoriented. Then he saw Lena through the windshield of the command vehicle. And he smiled, small, exhausted, genuine. Lena's throat tightened. She stepped out, moving toward him. Farid's voice was hoarse. "You're still here." Lena nodded once. "I said later." Farid's eyes flicked to Colonel Arslan, then back to Lena. "They blamed you, didn't they?" Lena's mouth twitched faintly. "They tried." Farid exhaled slowly. "Good, because I needed them to show their hands." Lena blinked. "You wanted." Farid nodded slightly. "The hospital breach wasn't only about me. It was about who would fold under pressure." Lena's eyes narrowed. "That's dangerous." Arad's gaze softened. "So is everything we do." A medic team rushed in to assess Farid, guiding him gently toward an ambulance. Farid's hand caught Lena's wrist briefly. Not romantic, not dramatic, human. "Thank you," he whispered. Lena swallowed. "Stay alive, that's your job now." Farid's mouth twitched. "Yes, ma'am." As they loaded him in, Colonel Arslan approached Lena. "It's done," he said. Lena nodded, but her eyes were distant, already thinking about the hospital, about Marco, about the whispers that had to be corrected not only by authority, but by community. Because justice isn't complete until the people who watched you be shamed, watch you be honored. Pause. If you want the final public vindication, the moment when the entire hospital finally understands who Lena is and what she's done, subscribe now. Because the ending pays off the title in a way that's quiet, dignified, and unforgettable. They brought Farid back to the field hospital under heavy but discreet escort. Not to turn the place into a fortress, but to restore trust. When the ambulance doors opened, staff gathered, nurses, medics, translators, even a few doctors. Sana stood at the front, eyes wet with relief. Marco stood farther back, arms stiff, face pale. Farid was wheeled in, monitored, stable. He insisted, despite weakness, on stopping near the nurses' station. Elise tried to protest. "Mr. Demir, you need rest." Farid lifted a hand weakly. 1 minute. The ward quieted. Even the monitors seemed to beep softer. Farid's eyes found Lena. She stood beside Sana, hands clasped, expression controlled. Farid's voice was hoarse but clear enough to carry. "This is a fictional story," he said suddenly, and a few people blinked in confusion, because it sounded like a strange thing to say. Then he smiled faintly. eyes flicking upward as if acknowledging a narrator and an audience beyond the tent. "But what I will say is true within it," he continued. "Last night I was taken from this hospital, and I am alive because of the professionalism of the staff." He paused, breathing carefully. "And I am alive," he added, "because of Nurse Lena Sayegh." A murmur ran through the crowd. Marco's jaw tightened. Farid continued, voice gaining strength with purpose. "Some of you doubted her, some of you let others doubt her, and some of you used that doubt as a weapon." Marco flinched as if struck. Farid's gaze didn't leave Lena. They called her night nurse like it meant small, like it meant replaceable. He swallowed. But when armed men entered this hospital, she did not freeze, she did not panic, she did not trade fear for cruelty. His eyes flicked briefly to Colonel Arslan, then back. "She has skills you did not expect, not because she hides them for pride, but because she is here to serve, not to be worshipped." Lena's throat tightened. She didn't want spectacle. But she couldn't stop it now. Farid's voice softened. "And when I whispered a word, when I reminded her of what she used to be, I did it because I knew she would not abuse it." He paused, then said the line that fulfilled the title with quiet finality. "No one suspected the night nurse was a sniper," Farid said, "until armed insurgents breached the field hospital." The room went utterly still. Then Sana's hand found Lena's arm, squeezing hard, grounding her. Elise stepped forward, voice firm. "Let it be recorded. Lena Sayegh is commended for exceptional conduct under crisis." Dr. Kassem added, "And Dr. Vukovic's actions during and after the breach are under formal review." Marco's face drained. He tried to speak, but the sound died in his throat. Because this wasn't gossip now. It was record, witnessed, procedural, public. And that's when the room changed. Not with applause, with a collective recalibration. People looked at Lena differently, not as a myth, but as a professional whose dignity had been tested and proven. Farid was wheeled onward toward recovery. The staff began to disperse, murmuring in new tones. Marco stood alone, swallowed by the silence he'd tried to weaponize. Sana turned to Lena, voice trembling. "You didn't tell me." Lena's eyes softened. "I wanted to be just here with you, with patience." Sana nodded, tears slipping. "You are here." Lena exhaled slowly, the tension of days releasing in a controlled stream. And in the quiet aftermath, she walked back to her night shift station. Because the work didn't stop. It never did. Pause. Before we close this story, take a second to comment what you would have done in Sana's place when the accusations started. Would you have spoken up immediately, or would fear have made you quiet? I read those comments, and they shape which kind of justice stories I tell next. Marco's review moved faster than anyone expected. Because in crisis zones, you don't get unlimited chances. Elise made sure of that. The hostile environment complaints were formalized. The incident report discrepancies were documented, staff statements were filed. Marco wasn't arrested. This wasn't a cartoon villain ending. But he was removed from the rotation and returned to his sponsoring organization with a black mark he couldn't talk his way out of. His last day, he walked past Lena without meeting her eyes. At the gate, he stopped, turned slightly, and spoke without looking directly at her. "You could have ended me," he said, voice low. Lena's response was quiet. "I didn't want to end you." Marco's jaw flexed. "You wanted justice." "I wanted safety," Lena corrected. "Justice was the path." Marco swallowed, and for a second he looked like a man seeing his own smallness clearly for the first time. Then he left. The hospital didn't celebrate his downfall. They simply breathed easier. Farid recovered slowly. He remained guarded, but the staff treated him like any patient, because Lena insisted on it. No special treatment, no worship. Just care. One evening, weeks later, the generator hummed steadily, and the ward lights didn't flicker. Lena stood outside the tent at dusk, watching the sky bruise purple over the border hills. Sana joined her, handing her a cup of tea. "Do you miss it?" Sana asked quietly. Lena knew what she meant. The other life. The train stillness. The long distance watching. Lena took the tea, warming her hands around it. Sometimes I miss the clarity, she admitted, but I don't miss what it cost. Sana nodded, and now? Lena's eyes stayed on the horizon. Now I choose this every night. Sana's voice softened. You're not just a night nurse. Lena's mouth twitched faintly. I know. Sana hesitated. What will you do if it happens again? Lena's gaze sharpened, but her tone stayed gentle. I'll do what I did last time. Which is? Lena looked at Sana, eyes steady. I'll keep people alive, and I'll refuse to become what the world expects. Sana smiled through tiredness. That's a hard way to live. Lena nodded once, but it's a clean one. Inside the hospital, a monitor beeped steadily. Life in numbers, hope in rhythm. Lena turned back toward the entrance, toward the lights, toward the beds. Back to the work. Because vindication wasn't the applause. It was being trusted again. And being able to do her job without being punished for competence. Pause. If this story hit you the way it was meant to, if you felt the injustice, the restraint, and then the slow, satisfying snap of vindication, subscribe for more fictional, high-retention narratives like this. And if you want the next story to follow a different kind of hidden competence reveal, tell me what profession you want the hero to have in the comments. Farid left the hospital months later, walking slowly but upright. Before he went, he asked to see Lena privately. In the small admin container, he sat across from her with a thin folder on the table. Lena eyed it. If that's another list, I don't want it. Farid smiled faintly. It's not, it's something simpler. He slid the folder toward her. Inside was a letter. An official commendation from the NGO coalition, signed by Elise, Dr. Kassem, and Colonel Arslan. It didn't mention sniper. It didn't glorify violence. It praised professional conduct under armed breach, de-escalation, patient protection, staff safety. It was the kind of document that could protect Lena the next time someone tried to erase her with suspicion. Lena stared at it for a long moment. Farid's voice was soft. I wanted you to have armor that doesn't require a weapon. Lena swallowed. Thank you. Farid studied her. You're still carrying guilt. Lena's eyes lifted, sharp. You don't know what I carry. Farid nodded. No, but I know the look of someone who has decided not to let the past define the work. Lena's voice was quiet. Some nights it's harder than others. Farid leaned back, exhaling. Then keep choosing, that's all we can do. Lena folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the folder. Farid stood slow but steady. Will you ever tell them everything? Lena shook her head. They don't need everything. They need to know I'm safe to stand beside. Farid nodded, understanding. At the door he paused. Lena. She looked up. Farid smiled faintly. No one suspected. Lena's expression softened, just a fraction. They didn't have to. Farid left. Lena sat alone for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of a border that never truly slept. Then she stood and returned to the ward. Because in the end, the moral wasn't that Lena was secretly extraordinary. It was that humility can hide competence, and prejudice can miss it, until crisis forces the truth into the light. And when that light comes, the only thing that matters is what you do with it. Pause. Before you go, watch the next story on this channel if you want another fictional tale where someone underestimated becomes the one person a powerful authority can't ignore. And if you're still at the end, leave a like, because it tells me you want more long-form, cinematic justice stories with heart, restraint, and a payoff that actually earns its title.